Hello and welcome to Meet Our Makers, an artist interview podcast produced in association with Beats Per Minute. I'm your host, Jeremy J. Facette. On this episode, we get to meet Julian Brave NoiseCat. Julian is a filmmaker, documentarian, and writer who last year put out his debut documentary film, which he co-directed, called Sugarcane, which is all about the inherited trauma, generational trauma, and the history of and the effects of the Indigenous boarding schools that a lot of Native children in Canada and America were sent to by basically Christian missionaries over many decades. And a lot of abuse and neglect happened there. If you know anything about the history, you know that that's a woeful understatement. But one of these in Canada did affect Julian's relatives and family directly. In fact, one of them is where his father was born. And Sugarcane explores not only his own story, but the story of the culture and the society and the community around it, and the people that he grew up around and knows, and how they were affected by it, and how those effects ripple onward. But also more recently, this year, this fall, he put out his debut book called We Survived the Night, which he uses as a method of memoir, exploring his own story more deeply, personally, his background, his parents' background, and so on and so forth, but also weaving in a lot of the stories, such as the trickster stories from Native mythology and origin stories. It's a really interesting mix of the personal and the communal and the historical. And I was really excited to get to talk to Julian after reading some of the book, watching the movie, being sort of floored by the movie. If you haven't watched it, please go watch it. If you haven't read his book, please go read it. And it was a really exciting conversation for me to talk about these really serious topics that he explores in his work, but really go deep with them and pick his brain a little bit. If you've seen Sugarcane, you know the tone of it, as we talk about in the talk, is quite lyrical, patient, sort of poetic. So it was nice to kind of get to hear him in a conversation, chatting about these really intense and really important topics. We talk about a lot about art, we talk a lot about community, we talk a lot about language and history. It's a really rich conversation, and one that I think is especially worthy to be having right now. So thank you for listening. This is me meeting Julian Brave NoiseCat. So hi, thank you for coming to hang out for a little bit.
Yeah, me too, man.
We should say you've had quite a year. Usually I, have people on here who have like a thing that's out, but I feel like you've had so many things kind of happening at once, in the grand scheme of time. Because earlier this year, or really last year, you had the film come out, Sugarcane, and then it was Oscar nominated earlier this year. And now, mere months on, about 2 weeks ago, you put out your first full book.
Crazy.
Busy time.
Yeah.
So how are you faring these days?
I'm a little tired today, personally. I flew in from, I'm in Vancouver, BC today. Flew in from Calgary, had an event yesterday. This is the first day in almost 2 weeks that I haven't had an event.
Oh, wow.
So I'm just doing a lot of talking. And
Yeah.
it's hard for it not all to, it's interesting. You try to be fully present in all of it. I mean, just to be grateful for it, and to also, especially in nonfiction, the expectation is that you embody the story in a
Right.
way. And that is what I try to do. I try to be super present in what I'm doing, and how I'm expressing the story and all that sort of stuff, which, takes a lot out of you. It's almost like, I mean, the people don't really think about it this way, but like nonfiction is almost kind of like a performance art in that kind of a sense, because it asks you to be fully there in the story that you're telling.
Right. You can't go into the world that you've created and kind of go
Yeah.
behind these characters you've made up. And
Yeah. It's like
yeah.
it's like method acting for life or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, it's taken a lot out of me, and it's also harder. I try to come at the whole thing from a place of gratitude for um, just getting to do this. I mean, especially in this day and age, it's really hard to make a living making art and telling
Hmm.
stories. I mean, every time I look back at journalism, which is the part of the world I come from, there's fewer and fewer seats, and
Yeah.
the funding and the world of culture is kind of in a recession, broadly speaking, whether you look at the public funding for it, the philanthropic funding for it, the actual decline in readership for print culture and all that sort of stuff. So to get to do this work right now is a real honor and a blessing.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, it's when your work is so much of it is derived from your personal and family history. It's hard not to take everything personally, I guess.
Yeah.
It's hard not to, like, when you don't make that list that you were hoping you'd make, or you know
Right.
when you don't get that award nod that you were hoping you might get. It's hard not to be like, man, fuck these
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah.
But that's just the nature of the thing.
Right.
And I think that we all, when we make art and we do stuff, I played a lot of sports growing up. We all hope that it goes as far as it can possibly go and is as big as it can possibly be.
Yeah.
And this has definitely been a rocket ship of a year for me. And in
Yeah.
a way, it is a little bit of a curse to have had your first major project be nominated for, like, the biggest award in all awards. It's just kind of like, how are you ever gonna capture that kind of success ever again? So
Yeah. But maybe on the other hand, it's like you got it. You captured that. So maybe now you can kind of do whatever do whatever you want now.
maybe, yeah.
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
yes, but also, it is it's a very competitive world out there, and to get to keep doing this stuff, especially if you're gonna just be like, right now, I'm just making art to make a living.
Yeah.
You do have to have a certain amount of success, and when you're making sort of highbrow indigenous nonfiction, whether it be in film or books, you gotta you're swimming up the current, you're paddling up the current of culture.
Hmm.
There's a reason why dominant culture hasn't produced that much of this stuff, or given that much of this stuff love.
Yeah.
And so I'm hyper aware of that, like, America doesn't give a damn about Indians, and it's
Mm.
hard to get people to pay attention to books in general right now. And then, this book is also breaking a lot of rules, of nonfiction in this craft and all that sort of stuff. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, the book We Survived the Night, I just realized we had not actually said the name yet, is out now. And you mentioned that you come from the world of journalism, and there is certainly a journalistic aspect to the book.
mhm.
I would imagine there were a lot of research that went into this book. But it is
Tons.
also a memoir.
Yeah.
Like you say, it kind of does break the rules, or sort of fudge the lines, because it's like a cultural history. It's
Yeah.
also a memoir, which is very specific to you.
hmm
And then it's also mythology.
Yeah.
So it does sort of mix all these different worlds.
Yeah.
Was that sort of a tricky thing to balance, or was that kind of just how it naturally happened?
Yeah, the book evolved as I was writing it, as any book does. We Survived the Night. I originally envisioned it more as a reported book about Indigenous peoples across Canada and the United States today, because I wanted to tell a story about indigeneity that decentered the nation state, that
Mm,
put Indigenous peoples at the center of our story, across our land. Um, and I always understood that there was going to be a personal through line for that, so that it would be that kind of a story, beginning with myself and my family and expanding outwards from there. What really happened is there was a discovery in May of 2021 of 215 potential unmarked graves at an Indian residential school in British Columbia. In fact, one of the schools that my grandmother was sent to.
hmm.
And after that, there was a real reckoning across Indian country with this history of forced assimilation through educational institutions, the Indian residential schools in Canada and the Native American boarding schools in the United States, including especially among my own people and my own family. And that really sort of set in motion a series of events that transformed my life and the book.
Hmm.
I decided to move back in with my dad at the age of 28. He left our family, my mom and myself, when I was 6 years old. So we hadn't lived together for 22 years and had a bit of a complicated history and relationship. He still owes me the money that I loaned him to come to my own high school graduation, for
Yeah.
example. And suddenly we were living across the hallway from each other, and he's an artist, so he'd be out in the garage carving while, rocking out to Led Zeppelin, taking rips from the bong, adzing away at a log, while I'd be like hunched over my laptop working on my book and my first documentary.
And was
Which
this
is,
was
by
this
the
back
way,
up in British Columbia?
this was in Washington State,
Okay.
actually. Yeah, in a little Navy town called Bremerton, Washington.
Okay.
There's a big Navy base and shipyard there. And so I'd be like hunched over my laptop working on my projects, which, just as an aside, like it's unfair to have a when you are also an artist, it's unfair to have a visual artist for a father, because, like, when he gets to make his art, it's like a damn music video in his studio.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, like, I'm like, I have a writer's back and I'm like hunched over a
Yeah.
laptop and
Yep.
nobody can talk to me. It's like
Yep.
very uncool, unsexy. And like I'm 32 years old and I'm already like complaining about my shoulders and my
Hey, right there
back and
with
my
you.
hips and all that sort of stuff. And I had this notion when I set out to write the book that a big strand of it would be, or that a part of it, sorry, not a big strand, would be oral history. Initially, I thought that these would be like ways I would ornament the text, like, little flourishes. And so I was reading in like 100-year plus old anthropological texts these oral histories from my own people's culture, the largest body of which were the coyote stories.
Hmm.
And one day I was reading in like a JSTOR PDF, which is really how I had to consume these stories, because they are, almost dead among
Yeah.
my own people. And suddenly I was reading, here in the PDF about my epic trickster forefather ancestor Coyote, who was a great creator and destroyer and also a little bit of a deadbeat dad. And I was looking over here across the hallway at my father, my roommate, at this epic creator, destroyer, mischievous trickster, deadbeat dad. And then I was looking back at the PDF and back at my dad and back at the PDF and back at my dad. And all of a sudden it hit me. I was like, oh my God, my dad is Coyote. And part of the purpose of the Coyote stories as a tradition was to understand Indian men like my father and my grandfather and my uncles and myself.
Hmm.
And that insight really fundamentally transformed the book. I was writing We Survived the Night at the same time as I was directing Sugarcane. So I was thinking very purposefully about which traditions of my own people I had the responsibility to bring back to life on the page, because our culture was nearly wiped out by colonization and by
Hmm.
schools like St. Joseph's Mission, the school my family was sent to and where my father was born, and found in a trash incinerator when he was a newborn. And so I was really grabbed by this idea. Would it be possible to write We Survived the Night in the style and tradition of a coyote story, a form of oral history that my own people have always considered to be nonfiction, but that nonfiction itself, as a genre, as a way of looking at and understanding the world and its truths, has never taken seriously as nonfiction.
Mm.
And that thought fundamentally transformed the whole book, into this sort of woven text that combines, memoir and reporting and criticism, I guess is what people would call it, although I kind of just call it like having an opinion, and oral history into a woven narrative of that's trying to knit back together an identity of self, an identity of family, community, and a people across North America, in the wake of this history of colonization that has very nearly, broken us.
Hmm. So was sort of like stumbling upon this deeper well of the coyote stories and everything that brought you. I mean, did that sort of was that a light it was a light bulb moment for the book, but was that also kind of a light bulb moment for you personally, like in your life and like kind of looking like, whoa, like wait a second.
I think so. I was directing Sugarcane at the same time as I was writing We Survived the Night, and Sugarcane is really a study of a system that nearly wiped indigenous ways of life off the
Hmm.
face of the earth from Canada to the United States. And when you're working on that kind of project and you're a storyteller and a student of your own people's history and art and culture, you inevitably ask yourself which parts of my people's culture, and in particular our narrative traditions, do I, as a storyteller, have a responsibility to try to bring back to life
Hmm.
on the page and in my work and in my life beyond that. And I think that that really led me to the Coyote stories, which are one of the largest bodies of oral literature in the history of humanity, probably. Indigenous peoples from Central America all the way up to Western Canada used to tell stories about the trickster coyote, and including my people. He was our account of how the world came to be and why things were the way they were. And he is a really interesting, complicated kind of character. He was sent to the earth by Creator to set things in order. And while he did some good, he was often up to no good. After filling the rivers with salmon and populating the lands with descendants, he turned around and used the fish to try to marry into every single native village along the river that would have him because he was a bit of a womanizer.
Mm.
And then after filling the land with all these descendants, he abandoned us because he was probably the most epic deadbeat dad ever known to human history. In every single story about the trickster coyote, he was an example to our children of how not to be, and yet we considered him second only to the creator himself in
Hmm.
our account of creation. He was kind of like he was an embodiment really of the contradictions inherent to our own human nature, a
Yeah.
representation of the paradoxes that we see in the world when we witness, transformation and change.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that in that way, he remains, I think, a very powerful character, idea, metaphor, all of the above to understand not just indigenous life and history and environmental change and cultural change. All of these things are found in the Coyote stories, but also I think a way to understand the history and current events even of North America more broadly.
Hmm.
And my general feeling is that like this tradition gets at so much and contains some remarkably ancient memories of events. Like for example, one of the coyote stories I recount in the book correctly places where there was actually 11,000 years ago an ice dam that held
Mm.
up a series of glacial lakes across the interior of British Columbia, Canada. And when you have an oral tradition that is thousands and thousands of years older than the pyramids in the Bible, that is relaying, from mouth to ear across countless generations, these major parts of North American history, I think that that kind of thing demands to be taken seriously in a way that it never has.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think that that is part of now. Um, it's not my only life mission, but I do think that, I see myself as part of a generation of Native artists and storytellers who are, insisting that our way of life, our stories, get at essential things for not just our own people, but a broader humanity to understand.
Yeah. And it's interesting the tie that you felt like you found between him and your father and that sort of experience those experiences echoing each other more than maybe you were anticipating. But I mean, you talk a lot about both of your parents really in the book. I was sort of especially moved by the anecdote relatively early on where basically you mentioned that both your parents were trying to get away from where they were from.
Hmm.
Your father, for people who haven't read the novel, and you say this, not you say this, but this is basically in Sugarcane as well. But he goes very far, right? He met your mother where in Boston.
No, they met at close. They did live in Boston in Southie,
Okay,
actually. That's where they got married. But they
okay,
met at the Shadowbrook, which was my dad thought it was a disco, actually. He was headed out for a night on the town. He had just moved from Vancouver, British Columbia to just outside the city of New York, where he
right.
was working as a as a printmaker. He studied stone lithography in
Mm-hmm.
art school, and he, was running away from a really dysfunctional, dystopic childhood. I mean, his life began in the trash incinerator at an Indian residential school that was built, in the words of one of the attendants of these schools, to get rid of the Indian problem. That
Mm-hmm.
was the whole idea. And from there, his life was pretty harrowing. It's kind of remarkable that he even survived, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest. And so he tried to get as far away from the Canim Lake Res where he grew up as he possibly could, which led him to New York, New York, where he met my mom, who's a Irish Jewish New Yorker, in a bar outside of the city called the Shadowbrook.
Mm.
And my dad walked in, and my mom was the bartender, and she poured him free drinks all night. And at the end of the night, he was like, "What the heck can I do here to get myself a new girlfriend?" And he pulled a golden feast ladle earring out of his left lobe and gave it to her. And I guess that is kind of essentially how I came to be.
Right.
And spoiler alert, but like their marriage didn't work out, in large part because of my father's alcoholism.
Right. And I mean, he basically mentions that in the film too. But yeah, I just found that really an interesting connective tissue there, that, you have this figure in oral histories, Coyote, who is like this, like you say, deadbeat. He always leaving. He's always going from one place to the next. But then you have this father who went across a continent to get as far away from where he was from as feasibly possible. And then he met your mother, who you say in very different ways was trying to get away from where she was from. And I think in that sense, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I think in her sense, that meant maybe less so geographically and more so sort of mentally, emotionally away from where she was from. If that
Yeah.
is that
Yeah,
correct?
that's probably a good way to put it. My mom, sometimes I joke that my mom was first generation white. My grandfather was an Irish Catholic guy who went to seminary and then became a literary journalist, which is just about the most Irish Catholic career path you could possibly imagine for the mid 20th century. He was the lead writer for a magazine called Look that
Mm,
was pretty similar to Life magazine and folded in like the late 60s or 70s. And after that, he got a few book contracts for books that he never finished and kind of like lived out his life as a freelancer working from a shack behind the house. And so my mom's family was kind of like intellectual but poor.
mm,
They lived off of my grandmother's pink collar secretary salary. And my mom was the youngest of four kids and kind of neglected, I would say, by her parents. My grandmother was an orphan, and so she had her own complicated history of stuff that she dealt with as a kid, and I think that influenced the way that she was as a mother. And my mom kind of bore the brunt of that as the youngest and kind of the unwanted one. But it turned out she was really smart. She got a scholarship to go to a elite private school outside of New York called Hackley that educated like the kids of Malcolm X and Betty Shabazz, for example.
mm.
And from there, she went on to Yale University, and I guess that kind of success forced her family to pay attention to her.
Right, right,
And she was always she was always a bit of an odd duck. She always felt like an outsider in the sort of, even though she was whip smart, she always felt like an outsider in the sort of New York cultural intellectual scene. She always felt like an outsider at Hackley and at Yale, these very elite educational institutions. And when she was in college, she dated women. The vast majority of her boyfriends were non-white. She was really, I think, trying to find something different
right.
and apart from the world that she came from and felt very not a part of and very alienated by. And so, you know, even interestingly, she was looking into like I think it was teaching jobs or jobs with the Bureau of Indian Education or something like that. when my dad walked into the
Mm.
bar where she was the bartender. And, that set her on a whole different
Yeah.
uh, life path that led to me. And
Yeah.
they were both like that. My dad was also trying to get away from the world that he came from.
Right. And you dedicate the book to her.
Hmm.
Um, how what led you to doing that? I think the dedication is who showed me how.
Yeah, yeah. For my mother, who showed me how, which
Yeah.
is two four-syllable lines,
Mm.
which is in keeping with the way that the poetic interludes, the first day, the second day, the third day, and the fourth day, are also structured through the text, which is a reference to four as a sacred number, and as in particular very significant for my fasting, which is a ceremony that I have participated in the last 4 years of my life while I was writing the book. And the book would never have been possible in the broadest sense without my mom. I mean, the book and my life have really been influenced by the fact that my father was this epic Indian artist dad who left. Um, but the other side of that story is that my mother was an Irish Jewish New Yorker who, for instinctual reasons, I guess, chose to keep me connected to him and the native side of my family. Every winter she would drive me all the way from Oakland, California to the Canim Lake Indian Reserve, which is over 1,000 miles
Yeah.
country away, to go visit my family. And they welcomed her with open arms. They consider her their auntie, their sister, which is a really, really beautiful thing in a way that I think Native people often are
Yeah.
with our with our extended families and with other people, including outsiders. She brought me down to the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland, California, which is the third oldest urban Indian community center in the country,
Mm.
so that I could remain connected to my culture. She even learned how to bead so that I could have my own powwow regalia to dance.
Oh wow.
And even today, she remains like my first reader and editor of my work. And
Mm.
so, you know, in the broadest sense, like, I would not be who I am. I would not be so connected still to my people, my family, my culture, my identity if it weren't for the actions of my white mother,
Mm.
which is another part of the story, and why she is a prominent supporting character in the book.
Yeah. When you were going through this lengthy process of writing the book and figuring out what the book was and exactly what you wanted to say with this book, um, I'm curious what some of the more sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, sort of moving, like revelations or discoveries were for you. Like, especially, maybe not even especially, but I was going to say within your own story, your own direct lineage, your own, going back through your family's history, like, what were some of the sort of most surprising or most moving moments for you?
Um, in writing the book,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say
Or even the research element.
I would say that what I was always looking for when I was researching and writing this book, were stories about indigeneity and my family and myself that I felt I could learn something from.
Mm.
I think that there have been a number of, like, sort of Indian 101 books out there, and those books play a role, but that wasn't really what I was interested in. I think that indigeneity is a really fascinating sort of life position to occupy in the 21st century. I think that there are so many parts of North American current affairs and history and culture that you can understand by, looking at Indigenous peoples and our stories and our ongoing importance, despite our persistent marginalization in the way that the story is told.
Mm.
Um, and I think that I found myself drawn to, both in my own story, my family story, and in the stories that I chose to report, um, stories that I felt got at something important but overlooked in the story of Indigenous peoples in North America more broadly, and stories that actually came from Indian country but that illustrated something about North American history and culture. For example, that led me to the history of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, who is a tribe descended from the lost colony of Roanoke, which is the first English settlement in North America, um, that assimilated essentially into the surrounding indigenous peoples, whose descendants include the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, which is also the largest tribe east of the Mississippi,
Mm,
and a tribe that has not actually gotten full recognition from the federal government as an American Indian tribe. And
mm,
so their history really gets at, you know, who does and doesn't get to count as native, and what forms of assimilation do we see through the law and through the way that we tell the story of America. And very interestingly, despite the fact that throughout history there have been lots of examples, and including today, of non-native people who have chosen to assimilate into native society and culture, um, the legal system and the way that native identity is still legislated through forms of measurement of racial purity essentially doesn't make it possible for us to see that kind of assimilation. Assimilation is only supposed to go from Indian to not Indian or less
right,
Indian over time.
right.
Uh, and so I think that there are stories, many stories like that, that actually illustrate something broader in North American history and culture, things about race, things about assimilation, identity, what parts of the reality out there in the world is our legal system able to see, and which parts are made invisible. And again, like, Native history and current affairs can actually get at those kinds of things.
So, would you consider um, the book We Survive the Night? Would you consider the book sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Like a companion piece to the film? I mean, there is an intersection, but they're not truly fully about the same thing.
Yeah, I think that they listen, they were written and directed at the same time, so they inevitably influenced one another. And
Right.
I think the biggest way that they influenced one another was at the same time as I was directing this film, I was also writing this book. And the book is kind of squarely about what it is to bring our traditions and culture and way of life back to life on the
Yeah.
page. Um, and so that was very influenced by the fact that the film is a study of the system that nearly wiped those things off the face of the earth. I'll
Right.
just say as an aside, interestingly, I mean, the book has sold really well and been received really well. But my general sense is that um, the liberal imagination or the left of center sort of disposition is one that is very willing to say, like, Native people endured bad things in history and still today. Like, it's possible for liberals to feel a form of guilt about this stuff, but the part where you start saying, and the indigenous way of life was good, and the traditions and culture and way of telling stories gets at a lot of truths that are unseen, and maybe this is a position of unrecognized power in North American history and culture, you start losing people when you add that part in.
Hmm.
So there is an element, I would say, of an inability to follow the logic all the way from not only was this system bad, but what it was attempting to eliminate, the native culture and way of life and way of seeing the world and telling stories and moving through it, was also good. And I think that to me has been a little bit instructive as to where culture, broadly speaking, needs to continue to move in order for these kinds of works and stories to be made possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think that culture and art is supposed to be pushing the boundaries of the narratives and truths that the mainstream is willing to accept in certain
Yeah.
ways.
Do you feel like with this book, I'm sure it was many years in the making and, the film happened to come out first, but do you feel like with this book, you accomplished what you set out to accomplish?
Oh man, I don't know. It's only been out in the world for 2 weeks.
I know it's so new.
It's yeah. I mean, listen, I'm really proud of it. I think the thing is that you can never predict how work is going to be received
Right.
by your own family, by your own community, by people beyond that.
Yeah.
So far, I've been incredibly lucky that the film, as well as the book, has been really received so warmly by the people who've watched or picked it up and opened it or listened to the audiobook. Um, one thing that I didn't fully anticipate is I narrated the audiobook.
That's how I've been reading it.
Yeah, and the book is also includes a lot of words in Secwepemc, my people's language, and other indigenous languages.
Right.
And I was also thinking about it, and the book engages in a lot of oral history. The way that I'm a really slow reader, in part because the way that I read is I hear the words in my head when I'm reading, and I
Mm,
write similarly. And so there is almost a way in which the way my brain works and the way that I read and the way that I write is kind of straddling the line between oral and print culture in a moment wherein our entire society is straddling the same line between
hmm.
oral and print culture. And, I guess I would have never predicted this, but this week I've been feeling increasingly like maybe the way that I should be thinking about the book and my work on the page is as like the script for a post-literate like sort of oral culture. Maybe the primary way in which people will be engaging with and consuming my stories, is not necessarily in print, but through forms like the audiobook. And I did really enjoy doing the read for We Survived the Night.
Mm,
And so that's sort of a way in which and something that I wasn't thinking about consciously when I was writing the book and everything, but that has come up in the way that just in what I've been seeing through the way people have engaged with the book, including members of my own family, been a way that I've started to reflect on what I made and how it's going to move through the world,
yeah.
which, you're always kind of calibrating these things as you move so that you can think about it for what you're working on next.
Right. Yeah, the language aspect has been so interesting too. And I think it's something um that as the reader, as a reader, I'm receiving differently hearing you read the book as opposed to if I was sitting and looking at the page because, of course, I would think, of course, I wouldn't know how to say the words
Yeah.
that you're saying, right? So like hearing you say them has been so intriguing and like the histories that you get into with the linguistics of it is so interesting. I mean, I'm an English teacher, so maybe that's part of why it's interesting to me, but like it is interesting like you to put my English teacher hat on, you get down to the morpheme, which is like so granular and it's just
Yeah.
like but like
The most basic
yeah,
linguistic unit of meaning. We go
I
there.
yeah, I was just telling my husband about the words with no vowels and he was like, "What?"
Oh,
But like
he had in his possession a bunchberry plant.
yeah.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
New Hulk.
Yeah.
I couldn't
Um
do that one again, but I do narrate it in the book
yeah, I
correctly.
was listening to that and I was like, that's so interesting. And it's something that I feel like really does come alive orally as opposed to if I was just reading on the page. So I think there is kind of like a nice synchronicity there with what you're talking about and the fact that I and many others are listening to you talk about it.
Yeah, I think that there's a way that indigenous cultures, which are sometimes described as pre-literate, although I think that's a little bit of a problematic
Hmm.
framing because, it assumes a kind of teleological development to culture and history that maybe is not a real thing. Um, that our cultures firstly get at like lots of interesting and important questions around relationships between people and place and land. One of the things that I get into in the book is like the fact that the root morpheme for both land and people in the Salish languages, when you trace them all the way back to their proto language, as linguists have, are is the same thing,
Yeah.
which suggests that our understanding of what it is to be human and the connection to land is an inherent thing, that there is something inseparable about our understanding of place and people.
Yeah.
And perhaps place also cannot be understood without its relationship to people, which I think is a really interesting concept and certainly a very different sort of one than the way that I think most Western and colonial societies relate to land, not as instead as like property or commodity or something that someone can point to and say, like, my God said that this is mine by right of discovery, that kind of
Right.
thing. And, similarly, I think that there is also, in particular for a people whose language is vanishing from the face of the earth, there are parts of our culture and way of life that can be recovered through an understanding of language. That there is a way of seeing the world through these languages.
Hmm.
And for those reasons, and also because I'm a writer, and I think writers are inherently always interested in language, or at least we should be.
Yeah.
I think the language is a very rich source for the book, and that's why the title of the book is itself derived from a word in my own language. "We survived the night" comes from the way that you give the morning greeting in Secwepemc. We say "Chokhuinoch," which doesn't mean good morning. It actually means you survived the night. And
Hmm.
ever since I learned that when I was learning language from my grandmother almost 15 years ago now, I have often wondered what it was for my ancestors to greet one another in the day with this simple yet profound acknowledgement that we'd made it to another morning. What
Right.
did that mean in the winter of 1863 when two-thirds of our nation died of smallpox? What did it mean in the mornings after the children were taken away to the Indian residential schools?
Yeah.
And also, what a like wry, dark humor kind of a thing to say to each other sometimes, like "you survived the night." Like that could
Yeah.
also be a witty reply. In Sugarcane, actually, there's a little Easter egg in there for people who understand our language, which is basically just people from my own nation and community. Um, in the culminating scene where I bring my father to go visit his mother,
Hmm.
I walk in the door with him and I say, "Chochuinoch, kya," like, "you survived the night, Grandma." And she responds, "Oh, don't remind me."
Yeah. That made me laugh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know it's such an interesting greeting. And I feel like I've heard, of course, I can't think of them now, but I've heard of like similar phrases from like around the world or other languages and vernaculars where like when you directly translate it, like whatever they're saying is not good morning. It's something very specific to that cultural understanding.
Mhm.
But you're right, there is kind of this dark comedy to telling someone you survived the night. Like no matter what happened in that night, like you survived it. And so that did make me smile when she responds like don't remind me. So speaking of the film, for a few minutes, while I have you, I just watched it very recently. And I'm curious about a lot of things, but I'm curious too about the structure of the film. You and your co-director, Emily Kassie, you're tackling something with this film which overlaps with what you tackle with the book, but you're tackling something in this film that is, of course, very large and sort of all-encompassing and very critical and very important. And then you shoot it through kind of like four lenses. You have your own and then like three other like people that we follow,
Hmm.
including the two women who are sort of like independently investigating.
Hmm.
So I'm curious, first of all, how you and Emily Kassie sort of landed on this structural choice to kind of get at this the heart of this bigger issue.
Yeah. I think that there was a few things. I mean, firstly, we wanted the film to tell a collective story. It was really important that this was the story of a people and a community,
Hmm.
not the story of an individual or a couple of individuals. And that's a hard thing to try to pull off in film, which lends itself often more to a more personalized kind of form of storytelling. I mean, there's a reason why you don't often see um, documentaries or films, and in particular, like verite films that have an ensemble cast.
Hmm.
Because it's hard to pull off, to be honest with you. Four storylines is a lot also to weave together.
Yeah.
Um, M had identified the three storylines that were not my own family's by the time I showed up, like a few days into she showed up a few days before the rest of our team to sort of like lay some groundwork. And when she showed up and told me, these are the people I want to focus on, I was like, I gave it some thought, and I ended up agreeing that, like, yes, these are people who make sense. What I could not have predicted was, firstly, that she had chosen to focus the documentary on the very same school that my family was sent to and where my father was born. That was not something that I knew.
Oh, that
Uh,
was like happenstance?
that was
Oh,
happenstance, yeah.
wow.
She had chose to focus the documentary on the very same school that my family was sent to and where my father was born. There was 139 schools across Canada, so that was incredibly improbable.
So you
And
knew that that was the topic, but not which school she had chosen.
when I agreed, yeah,
Right.
not, yeah. So that was really crazy. And that laid before me a set of other considerations for myself and my family, which was like, was I willing to go there with my own story and my own family story?
Hmm.
And my story and my family story was the last one that we really sort of shot. And it was also the last one that we figured out in the edit, in part because I didn't set out to make a movie about myself and my
Right.
family. Um, and I didn't want people to think that I had. And in part because it turned out that my story and my family's story, which is like a intergenerational story about the impacts of the residential schools that goes from my grandmother to my father to me, um, actually what ended up being like a strong way to enter and exit the narrative as sort of the through line in the film.
Mm.
And that was something that we figured out in the edit, and one that I was personally a little bit hesitant to suggest because, like, again, like I didn't want people to think that I was there making a movie about my family and myself.
Yeah.
Um, but ultimately, I think that, it was it's kind of crazy to think that not only did M choose to focus on the school that my family was sent to, but that my father is the only known survivor of the incinerator at that school. And, here I am, someone who chose to become a writer, but became a filmmaker kind of by accident with
Hmm.
that film. And to me, that, that raises a set of questions around what role spirituality and forces beyond ourselves um, should play in our understanding of and relationship to some of these truths. Because the history of the residential schools was one of a form of spiritual colonization. That was very much what the people who ran these institutions understood themselves to be doing. And the way in which Native people have ourselves so often tried to heal from that history is also through our own culture and ceremonies. And if you're asking questions in your work about what is it to survive, what is the line between life and death, what is it to live, what is it to bring your way of life back from, the brink of oblivion, I think that those are inherently kind of spiritual questions, ones that purely secular approaches to nonfiction, which is in its history a very secular art form, um, are perhaps not necessarily fully equipped to answer.
Mm. Yeah, I was gonna ask if you were ever, I had it in my notes to ask if you were ever sort of having a second thought of even involving yourself at all. But I would imagine that, especially once you realized what the core plot, for lack of better words, of the film was, that maybe you, I don't know, was there even like a sense of like you had no choice, like you kind of had to tell your story in this, involved in this
Yeah, I
film?
was really hesitant at first. It was really important for me. Listen, there's a lot of nonfiction films, a lot of films out there in general that get made where they kind of plop a um, person of color onto the creative team so that it, you know, has the
Mm-hmm.
right representational politics,
Yeah.
for what is ultimately a very liberal industry. And it was really important for me that I was not seen as that, and that that was not the reality of the situation, even though I
Right.
had never made a film before. Um, and so one of the initial hesitations on telling my own story was like I wasn't going to let people into that until I really felt comfortable with what the project was that we were doing, um, and that my voice as a director was going to be respected. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that took some time for sure. Um, I was working with a team other than the composer that was entirely non-native.
Mm-hmm.
And once I felt like my ideas in my hand were going to be really guiding this thing, um, I also felt that it was really important that I reciprocated the generosity of spirit of some of the other participants in the film, like the late Chief Rick Gilbert, who led us into some of the most traumatic chapters and moments in their life
Yeah.
without having any directing control over how the film was being made. And ultimately, I felt like if the late Chief Rick Gilbert, who carried the history of abuse at this school in his literal DNA, was willing to trust us with his story. He went all the way to the Vatican to confess his truth to a representative of the Catholic order that abused him and four generations of his family. I ultimately felt that I had a responsibility to reciprocate that generosity of spirit by telling my own story,
Yeah.
a story that also helped get at and until Sugarcane and We Survived the Night story that had never been told about what happened to the babies born at St. Joseph's Mission, at this pattern of infanticide.
Yeah. I'm curious also about the style of the film. It's so lyrical and so patient. You mentioned like cinema verite earlier, and there is an element of that to this. A lot of cinema verite is essentially fiction
Mhm.
filmmaking that is using, non-actors and real locations and kind of guerrilla style shooting. And, that's a lot of the time what we associate with that term. But there is a verite feeling to this film because it's so, I don't know, it reminded me of like Terrence Malick and Kelly Reichardt and like these very slow, poetic filmmakers,
Mhm.
because this is not a talking head documentary. This is not, loads and loads and loads and loads of archival footage. There's a little bit of that, and then there's just a lot of presence and a lot of looking at what it's like now. How did you guys land on a tone for this? Because it must have been a very delicate balance because it's such a traumatic and tragic thing you're tackling, but there's also such a warmth to it and such a humanity to it as well.
Yeah, it felt really important to me. One of the things that I expressed to Emily early on was, there was this common refrain that you'd hear in liberal media that Native people had been talking about this history for ages and that, white people weren't listening.
Hmm.
And whenever I heard that, I was like, that's not true at all. That's not what I've seen in my own family. My own family doesn't talk about the residential schools at all.
Right.
And that was part of how we survived, this incredibly traumatizing experience was by trying to forget, was by silencing that history within our own, you know, personal and collective memory. And so that was one of the main things I think that we were trying to communicate was the silence of this history that was not only perpetrated or perpetuated, excuse me, by the church and the government, but also by Indigenous peoples ourselves. And I think part of what both Sugarcane and We Survived the Night are studying is, what is it to break those colonial silences within our own families and communities. And to do that, I think in Sugarcane in particular, it required a kind of, but also when We Survived the Night, a kind of patience and a willingness to um, allow life to unfold in the story and in front of the camera at the pace that life unfolds.
Right.
Because this was not going to be lurid sort of true crime kind of documentary. This was not
Right.
going to be a sit down talking head film that tried to be the definitive, historical survey of the Indian residential schools. This was a story about an investigation that was happening in the present at a specific school and the reckoning that that was reaping in the lives of the community and our specific participants,
Mm.
which required a kind of patient observational filmmaking that also allowed us to portray the incredible beauty of my people and our land,
Hmm.
which is an implicit refusal of the history of colonization, which said that, our way of life was backwards and bad and needed to go away.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a subtle pointedness to that, to just sort of capturing the beauty. It is such a it's just such a literally beautiful film. I mean, the filmmaking is really gorgeous. The cinematography is gorgeous. You mentioned the composer. What's the composer's name?
Malio Bomsawin,
Right.
in any sort of film, you know, especially when you're co-directing, there's only so many creative decisions that you can kind of like throw yourself behind in such a way that it like is impossible for other people to say no. And hiring Molly was one of the very few in Sugarcane that I played that
Yeah.
particular kind of way.
You're like, this is
And
happening.
yeah, I was just like I found her music through a review in I think The Guardian and NPR of her album Sweet Tooth.
Okay.
She's an incredible jazz folk musician, and her album Sweet Tooth was incredibly highly reviewed.
Mm.
And I listened to it, and immediately I was like, this person is insanely talented. And the genres that they're working in and the concepts that they're working with and all that sort of stuff will perfectly fit the world that
Yeah.
we're engaging in
Yeah.
Sugarcane. And Emily and Kellen, our producer, listened and agreed. But then they were like, but can she compose? And I was just like, I don't really care. She'll figure it out, Like, and that turned out to be what it was.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, the
you
music's
know,
beautiful.
it's beautiful. And,
Yeah.
I would say everybody got their flowers on this film. Molly was nominated, but I don't think we won a composing award specifically. We won some sound design awards and things like that.
Hmm.
But I think truly one of the standout pieces I mean, everybody did an incredible job on the film, don't get me wrong, but to me, what Molly brought to the score was truly special. And I think it's interesting how often Native people are pushing the boundaries of art and culture and aren't recognized for it.
Hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned everyone was sort of firing. It's true. I mean, beyond directing, score, cinematography, even the editing is so gorgeous. It's so again, it's just so patient. I mean, that sort of climactic scene between you, your father, and grandmother, we don't even see you guys. It cuts to the landscape, and I don't know, that choice kind of like, and we just hear what's going on. I don't know, that choice sort of took my breath away. It's like, I don't know, the editing, everything top down, and it's really just gorgeously assembled.
Yeah, that
Um,
that was also something that we shaped a bit in the field.
mm,
I was very careful and patient with my own family around my father's story and my grandmother's story and all these sorts of things.
hmm.
And I knew that we couldn't bring cameras into that situation, so we only did the audio,
Yeah.
which created some interesting filmmaking, storytelling sort of decisions that we had to figure out how to address, which is like, what do you just stay on the outside of the house while it's happening? And what we ended up deciding was we had this drone shot of, um, this sort of like dark twilight sky with like a break in the clouds that looks like kind of almost like a river in the sky that
Mm,
echoes the imagery of the Fraser River that you've seen before, and also places this reckoning between my father and my grandmother, in the context that it exists within, in the broader history of these schools, which is the context of our land,
Yeah.
uh, and our relationship to it, which has been broken but that endures. And we also needed, just from a filmmaking problem solving perspective, we needed a shot that was long enough
Yeah.
to cover
Yeah.
that in one shot. And so we actually slowed that shot. In actuality, was a little bit faster, but we
Okay.
slowed it down just a little bit so that
Hmm.
it could cover
It's
that
imperceptible.
bit of audio.
Um, yeah, and then, just really quick, the other thing, the postscript of the film includes the detail that there were essentially over 500 of these schools across the US and Canada, and that the last one closed in 97,
Mhm.
which, we were watching and we were just like, whoa, because I don't think that's something people realize.
Yeah,
Um,
and this history is incredibly, it's present. That was part of the
yeah,
whole point of the documentary.
right.
The documentary is told through a present day investigation at a residential school because in a certain way I feel we feel that the unmarked graves are a bit of a red herring, uh,
Hmm.
in the sense that the toll of these schools is not closed.
Yeah.
The ledger of a St. Joseph's mission runs long and remains open. There are still people who are dying from the impacts of
Hmm.
Indian residential schools. And I think that the fact that the last schools closed in Canada in 97, is yet another way to understand that this is a living memory, and not even just a memory. It is a living cancer on,
Yeah.
Indigenous peoples and on society more broadly.
Yeah, because that would imply, I mean, maybe I'm doing my math wrong, but that would imply that they're about kids who were there are maybe like our age, like 30s now. And that's just so not that long ago. And that it's just, it's not a history that I think everyone even knows about at all in general. But then if they do hear about it, it sounds like something that most of us would be like, oh, that must have been a really long time ago, though, right? And
Mhm.
then the fact that it is within our lifetime, within, it's the late 90s, like it was like a shocking detail to have there at the end.
Yeah.
Um, but it is ongoing. And I do get that sense from the film that it is this sort of present, like I said, there's such a presentness to it. We're in a present moment. I mean, we're investigating stuff that happened in the film. We're investigating stuff that happened decades prior that still has ripple effects and
Mhm.
still has echoes. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I think that in general, what Indigenous stories force people to confront is the fact that these processes that we consistently imagine as being, you know, part of the distant past, whether that be colonization as a project writ large or the assimilation of our people through, the policies of Canada and the United States, these things are not gone by any
Hmm.
measure. They are ongoing. They
Yeah.
are things that are still impacting Native people in our lives today. And yet, at the same time, our people are coming back from that genocide. Our cultures are resurging. People are learning to speak our languages again. Our way of life is returning to the land. Nowadays, Indian kids are proud to be
Hmm.
Indian, and that's a really beautiful thing.
Hmm.
And I think that's another part of what I'm trying to convey, through my work, is
Yeah.
that this stuff is coming back and it needs to.
Yeah. So now that you've gone through the processes, the two very involved processes of this book and this film, um, what are you looking forward to now? Rest,
Um,
I hope.
no, I have to. I mean, this is the thing, man. Is even with the success of Sugarcane and We Survived the Night, all that makes me is a working artist.
Mm,
You gotta, I gotta work to make a living.
hmm.
And that means I gotta keep producing, and I love doing what I do. I have a book proposal, or really actually it's not even a proposal anymore. I have a novel started, and I have an offer from my publisher on it. Um, I would like to be paid a little bit more. You got to the thing about being a working artist is you got to, at a certain point, you have to make enough money to justify working as an artist rather
Yeah.
than doing something else.
Yeah.
Um, and I would like to be paid a little bit more than what they've offered. So I'm going to keep writing and see if I can increase the offer. I have some life stuff happening that also means I gotta make some money. I'm also getting started on my next documentary, which I'm really excited about. And I just feel really grateful to make this work, to continue to grow and learn as a storyteller and an artist. There are other projects that I'm also prospecting. I'd like to get into writing screenplays.
Hmm.
I'd like to make a narrative film someday. I'd like to. Um, Today, I was talking to someone who's a playwright about potentially developing one of the parts of We Survived the Night into a play.
Mm.
I have a concept for an art piece that would begin sort of imagining what it would be to tell some of these trickster stories that I'm telling in We Survived the Night visually,
Mm.
through stills at least. And those are all things that I just love the opportunity to get to create, to make art, and to keep making a living. I got to keep making it.
Well, we're happy you're making it. It is, it's been cool to see this sort of rise. It's been what, maybe about a year-ish exactly since, not exactly, but about a year since the film came out initially, and now,
Came out at Sundance 2024,
okay,
so it's coming up on almost 2 years
almost
now.
2 years
Oh,
then,
geez,
yeah.
too. Yeah, it's
Um,
basically like 2024, 2025 were huge,
yeah,
like sort of first major works out in the world kind of
yeah,
years. And yeah, I'm really grateful for how it has all gone and how it's all been received so far. It's been pretty cool.
yeah. Well, we should say again, your first book, We Survived the Night, is out now. It's still pretty fresh off the press.
Go buy it.
Go buy it, go
There's
listen
also
to
an
it.
audiobook. I
Yes,
recommend the audiobook.
as would I. Yeah, go listen to it, go buy it. And then when you're done, or in between, go watch Sugarcane. It's on Hulu. You have no excuse.
Hulu and Disney Plus,
Yeah,
which I'll just say, if you canceled your subscription, that's totally, I understand. I had nothing to do, obviously, with the decisions of Hulu or Disney or any of these corporations.
yeah,
There's no choice but to work with them if you're going to try to get your art out into the world with any kind of scale.
yeah.
And they do have good art on there still.
There's
And
some
I
good
would
art on
say
there.
watch Sugarcane,
Watch Sugarcane. It's only like 2 hours. You can do it.
Hour 47.
It's not even 2 hours. It's true.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Julian, for chatting with me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Jeremy. I really appreciate it as well.
Yeah. Take care.
You too.